Let's get to it. So a little overview to kind of give us a grounding, like what this thing is and this thing called Agile Classrooms framework. I'll try to keep it short and sweet. Anyone see that versus Agile Classrooms and overview? All right, awesome. Okay, so there you go. It's just a quick overview. I'm John Miller, founder of Agile Classrooms, and started it in, 2011 was our first Agile Classroom, but we didn't call it that then, and we're experimenting, and we still do. But been doing it for a while and learned lots of things along the way, what not to do, what to do, and mostly learning from awesome teachers like Jim and Casey. Every time I see them apply something, I like, oh, that's really cool. Oh, that didn't work. Let me tweak the model a bit for you, make it a little bit better. So it's constantly evolving. I would say the intent of an Agile Classroom, to use the buzzwords, is to get future ready. Get students future ready, 21st century skills, whatever buzzword you want to put in there, but it's real. Those are real skills we need in the future. And the future, what that looks like is you're going to have just more complex problems and challenges in the world than we have today. And the world's increasing change faster and faster. It's constantly getting faster. So the skills of maybe 50 years ago, probably still important, but even more so when you have complex challenges and the world's changing. That means you need to adapt fast, or what we call agility, which is the property of being able to adapt to challenges that are outside and solve those challenges. And in the corporate world, in the industry, you have a way of working called Agile. And in this way of working, to be more innovative, to be able to adapt to this fast changing world, beat the competition, all that stuff, the trend is to form autonomous cross-functional teams. That means these folks aren't just taking orders, but they're out there, they're given a problem, and they're like, all right, you all solve it, figure out the best way of solving that. But they do it in short iterative cycles, so they can learn faster and deliver value faster. And there's lots of different frameworks that help people do that, but the umbrella term out there is Agile. That's the way of working. And you'll see where in this report called Jobs of Tomorrow's, the World Economic Forum 2020, they have a bunch of data behind this, and they said that, hey, here are the emerging jobs of tomorrow, of the future. And in that, a couple of things you'll see around Agile. This isn't the whole report, there's more, but you'll see like this little circle there. I should circle, it's not showing up, I think. There it goes. Agile software development. So how to use these Agile things to do product development, software development. You'll see Agile Manifesto pop up here. So you'll see this Agile term sprinkled all through about the future. And then you'll see these actual job titles. The product owner, which is a Scrum term, which is an Agile way of working. You'll see this term called an Agile coach. You'll see this thing called a Scrum master. So you'll see Scrum here mentioned a lot, which Agile Classrooms is inspired by. Project management, all these other things, leadership, all those are things that we do with Agile. And what Agile Classrooms does is says, hey, these are some really great approaches. Can we apply it to the classroom? And when we apply it to the classroom, it's got to change. They are students and teachers. They're not in a corporate environment developing products. They're developing learners. So we need to adjust this a bit for it to fit, for it to be right. And that's what Agile Classrooms does. So we adapt these iterative collaborative approaches from the product development world and adapt them to K-12 for learner development, for the goal of developing learners for today and tomorrow. Let's see if this works. I'm going to show you a little quick time lapse of a classroom. This is one of the first ones we did. It was a fourth grade classroom in 2010. I think it's 2011 actually, but 2010 here. Let's see if it works. There we go. And just a quick time lapse. They're not on Red Bull. They're not on caffeine. It's just time lapse there. And you'll see, it's hard to see, but you'll see like the kids in the back. They have these boards and these sticky notes that they're moving around. And what they're doing is managing their own work. And it's very visible to them. And you'll see the teacher flying around the room. She's on Red Bull as well. And she's just kind of going where she's needed, kind of coaching, supporting, right where she's needed. But you'll see that they're working in teams. Kind of hard to tell, but they're working in teams, and it's a very active, very active classroom. But these students are highly self-directed, and this is probably a couple months in of them trying it out. I think they're building a flying machine, little science project, but just a little glimpse of what it might look like in a classroom. It's just very busy. It looks disorganized, like crazy, but there's organization. If you actually watch the patterns, they're clustering together, working, they're aligning, using the visible tools and the processes that they're empowered to give them some structure. So I don't think we are interactive here, so I'll skip that. And I think the cool thing that I learned through all this is that it's about the process. That by giving students a learning process that's clear and explicit, that says, hey, here's a process for learning, it actually unlocks 21st century skills for all. You don't need to have like expensive robotic kits, which are awesome. I'm not saying don't have those, but you don't need those things. It's the skills, it's the process, right? That's behind the innovation of today and tomorrow that matters. And we can inject these skills anywhere in any kind of learning. It could be math, it could be a project-based learning class. So I think this is the cool thing, is that it doesn't really cost money. It's just, we need just a way of learning. And by harnessing these agile processes, we really develop and practice. It's more importantly that skills are better caught than taught. You have to practice them. You can't just talk about them and teach them. You have to practice them and do it frequently. You got to get your reps in, like in the gym, to build those muscles. And it builds authentic career and life skills. And it helps them become, I have found, much more engaged in learning, a lot more proud in their learning. So how does this work? Well, in Agile Classrooms, we have some basic steps, and it is always iterative and it's going to go back and forth a bit, but basically you make learning visible, be step one, and I'll show you what that looks like. And we use visible tools to make the process of learning visible, and that gives structure and clarity to students and the teacher, and the progress, the progress of learners, so they can adjust themselves and see where they are. This thing called learning sprints. So you then, after you make things visible, you add this thing called learning sprints, which we'll talk about. And then from there, you have these two dials, like in Laura's boombox that she carries around. You have these two little dials, treble and bass, but in our case, it's collaboration and self-direction. So unlike a corporate environment where like, hey, you're an autonomous team, you're an adults. And with kids and students, they're not always quite ready for that deep collaboration and that deep self-direction. So we need to scaffold that over time. And I think that's really the unique part of Agile Classrooms, is that it builds that scaffolding inside of it. So the process, really high level, just looks like this. It's just an iterative cycle in this thing called a learning sprint. And that learning sprint is typically about 4 weeks or less. And you time box it. You say, hey, it's at 1 week or 2 weeks. But by the end of that sprint, learners have something to show, to demonstrate learning, demonstrate some part of the project, and get feedback on. So by the end of that, they're at the beginning, they're setting their learning goals. And by the end of it, they've actually hopefully achieved their learning goals, and they demonstrate it and get feedback on their progress. And there's these things that we call these self-directed learning routines, and there's 5 of them. And this is explicit and deliberate practice of self-directed learning, but we chop it up. That way you get to say, all right, now we're planning. So refinement, which is just simply looking at your future goals, figuring out the order, scope, and sequence. Often the teacher's doing that. In some cases, the students might be involved. The planning part, which is what are we going to do? How are we going to learn it? That's pretty much it. A check-in, which is pretty much every day, almost like a formative assessment, you can think of it as, is, hey, how are we doing? Do we need any help? Is there anything blocking us? A review, and that's by the end of the sprint, the review happens, and they say, all right, here's what we did. Let's get some feedback, and retrospective. And I think this is the coolest part, personally, of the whole model, where the review is about feedback on the learning and the product of the learning. The retrospective is about the learners and how we learned. So it's about the process, our relationships. So we do deliberate reflection. We bake that time in to protect the time for that. And you just rinse and repeat that. So if you do it for, like, say you do it every week, you go through that entire cycle, all those steps, and then you repeat it the next week. And this is iteration. And you get feedback and you adjust as you go. And this is the adaptability part. And we also make learning visible. So we support that process with visible learning tools. This is just one of them. There's several, but the most common one that you'll see is what we call the learning canvas. And you'll see, like, if they were planning out their work, they would say, here's our learning objectives and here's how we're going to achieve it. What we see those tasks. And during the sprint, when they're actually learning, they're moving things along. Hey, I'm working on this, and now I'm done this thing and that thing. So you'll just see things move across the board. And maybe when they're done their tasks, they're like, hey, teacher or peers, I'm ready to get some feedback on this thing. It's ready for feedback. And there's some other things in the canvas here, but that's the basic gist. It visualizes the learning process, and it also visualizes the progress of learners. And that's visible to everybody: the teacher, the student teams. Now, these sprints repeat themselves. So say you did a 1 week sprint, learning sprint, you repeat the same process. And this is where you have to practice. Unlike, some project-based learning, which I'm a big fan of, I find that they often do planning only very rarely. And you never get good at planning if you only do it at the beginning. You're not going to get good at it. So we deliberately repeat these very frequently because we want to get them good at these skills as they're achieving mastery in whatever learning objectives they have. So you rinse and repeat this, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And ultimately, the idea is they're going to get better at it. The more they do, and in the first sprint, they're not going to be great at it. But over time, they're going to get better. And this is where we talk about scaffolding, choice, what we call choice or self-direction and collaboration. So in the beginning, we actually might start out where you're not being collaborative. They're just individual students working on their own stuff. That's a low level, very obviously lowest level of collaboration. Same thing with self-direction. You might start out with a learning sprint, but I'm just modeling it as a teacher. I'm telling the students what to do, but we're using the sprint, we're using the tools, and I'm modeling, getting them used to the process. But over time, we want to inch over. We have 5 steps, like 5 stages for this, like a rubric. But ultimately, you want to get in the self-directed to where eventually they're doing it on their own. But you're not going to usually do that at the very beginning. It's often turns into chaos, is my experience when teachers do it. Just kind of jump right in. So you have these 2 knobs, and usually between the sprints, the teacher and maybe even with the students, they reflect. Okay, can I increase some choice here? Can I increase some self-direction? And hey, is it time to maybe get them into groups or pairs, right? Or is it really time to get them into a real team where they stick together for a while? So with each sprint, you have an opportunity to scaffold and adjust that level. And sometimes you go backwards. Like, whoa, that was way too much self-direction. Everyone was, in anxiety. So we're going to maybe bring it back a step. But, the idea is maybe in the beginning, you're modeling just like a traditional classroom. I'm a teacher, teaching, instructing, telling them what to do. But eventually the goal is to get to a self-managing student team. And that is where the real magic happens, where students are managing themselves. And this is what really unlocks, where students, we found, obviously becomes more motivated, to become more engaged, take more ownership over their own learning. And with that, a lot more pride. Like they really feel accountable to making sure it's my learning process, my work. And as they shift into more collaboration, they support each other. They create, they hold each other accountable. They form stronger bonds and even friendships that they never would have. I've seen students cry at the end of the year because they had to lead their team. And those were tears of I love my team. And that only comes with time with, like working with a team for a while. And with that, all those things that are happening, it frees up the teacher time. The teacher can finally use the restroom whenever they want and not feel like the classrooms are going to go into chaos. But more importantly, they can spend that time to do the things they really want to do, give richer feedback, deeper relationships, whatever matters more, they have this time back for them. And I find it makes learning and teaching more enjoyable, more sustainable for the teacher with all these burnouts that are happening. We need more of that. But since the students are self-managing, it takes a lot of the pressure off the teacher, and it makes it safe to innovate. I think many teachers who are attracted to this want to innovate, but they feel it's not safe. And this gives some structure and some guardrails around that innovation process. And ultimately, they're going to feel confident that what I do really translates to the world. Even if they're doing, I don't say whatever subject, but even if there's a doubt, like, this is great, but would apply in work, the process they're using will always apply to the world of work. And that's the really awesome thing, is that they know that they're practicing these authentic 21st century skills. And it's pretty amazing. And I always find that teachers are always, after getting through a couple sprints, like, wow, I'm amazed by my students. I never knew they were capable of what we're seeing. And that's the overview.